Welcome to One Stop Nursing. Today we will discuss about the respiratory system. It's very important to understand the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system before you either study for the pathophysiology or for pharmacology. Alright, let's go ahead and review the respiratory system. Meet Mr. Rob. Mr. Rob is a retired professor and he's enjoying his life. And one day he went for a fishing trip. And so he's enjoying his fishing happily, and he even took this picture. Let's see what happens next. As he was fishing, he saw these two bears staring at him. Don't you think that's scary? Yeah, he got scared too. So he started running away from those bears. Bob started running and running and running. He was running really hard away from the bear so he won't become the meal for the bear. Rob started running and Rob started breathing really fast. Do you know why? Have you ever heard of a fight or a flight response? And that's the reason Bob was running really fast. And what is the flight or the flight response? Let's see. The fight or the flight response is actually mediated by the autonomic nervous system, especially the sympathetic nervous system. So what does the sympathetic nervous system do? They produce something called the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, and they act on the beta 2 receptors on the lungs. So when these epinephrine and the norepinephrine go sit on the beta 2 receptors, what is the outcome? So it produces the smooth muscle relaxation, bronchodilation, and it also increases the breathing rate. And that's what is necessary during the fight or the flight response, right? So when you need to fight or when you need to run, you need more oxygen, you need more energy, and that's why that's what you need when you're really running fast. Now that we know what causes the stimulation of the lungs, we need to know what actually happens inside the lungs. So before we know that, we need to know what are the structures of the respiratory system itself. So we all know that we have two lungs, right? We have two lungs, we have a trachea, we have two bronchus, and let me get the pointer. All right, we got the trachea, we got two bronchus, and you got the bronchioles, which are these smaller tubules, and they all end up in a air sac called alveoli, right? These alveoli are lined by blood vessels. We'll come back to it later. And let's look at the cross section of the alveoli. What do they have, and how does it look? These alveoli are air sacs that we, as we know, and they are lined by capillaries. Look at all these red capillaries all around the lining of the alveoli itself. They are very tiny capillaries. They also have macrophages. Macrophages are the immune cells. They kill all the microorganisms that they try to come in with the air that you breathe inside the lungs. And you also pay attention to these type 2 alveolar cells. So these are the cells that it's one of the cells in the lungs, and they secrete something called the surfactant. And what is a surfactant? It's the one that keeps the alveoli open. Otherwise alveoli will collapse on itself. Alright, now let's look at the pulmonary system or pulmonary circulation. And so we all know artery means which takes the blood from the heart to the rest of the body, right? But for that's exception to the rule, so the outlier, if you will, so is the pulmonary artery. So pulmonary artery, and the other thing is the artery carries what type of blood? Oxygenated blood. But the blood vessel that carries the blood from the heart to the lungs, that's why it's called the artery, but the artery which is supposed to be carrying the oxygenated blood now carries the deoxygenated blood. See, that is in blue. That means it's less in oxygen. That's all it means. So less in oxygen, and then it takes the blood to the lungs. If you pay attention to this picture, so all these blood that's coming out of the heart, it is going to different parts of the body. So here you can see liver, hepatic, stomach, renal, kidneys, lower part of the body. So all of the so when the blood vessels supplying to these body or the tissues or the cells, they take up all the oxygen for energy production, and then all these capillaries of the arteries, they form the vein. These veins do not have that much of oxygen because it gave up all the oxygen to the tissues, and they come back to the heart, to the right side of the heart, and now we know that's the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery carries the blood that's less in oxygen, and it takes the blood to the lungs where it can soak up all the oxygen in the air, and then it forms the blood vessel that's called the pulmonary vein. Again, it's the vein is supposed to carry deoxygenated blood, but the pulmonary vein carries the oxygenated blood. You see that in red? Okay, so that is the oxygenated blood coming out of the lungs and coming back to the heart, which is the left side of the heart, to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and then it goes back again through the aorta to the rest of the body. Now that we know how the lungs are supplied with the capillaries or the blood vessels from the heart, and now let's look at what happens in those capillaries and the alveoli itself. Okay, so this picture, you see the picture of the alveoli, and let me get a pointer here. Alright, so this is the pulmonary artery, which is the blue circle that you're seeing, and the yellow circle that you're seeing is the alveoli. Alright, now take a look at this oxygen. So O2 is the oxygen, and it's the concentration of the oxygen inside the alveoli. As you know, that the oxygen that we breathe in, the air that we breathe in, is higher in the concentration or the amount of oxygen, right? It's 105 millimeters of mercury. All right, now let's look at the pulmonary artery capillary. So you know pulmonary artery is carrying deoxygenated blood, which means that it is less concentration in oxygen, right? So which is 40 millimeters of mercury. So what happens during diffusion? So you know diffusion is the movement of the particles from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. Now we know the higher concentration is in the alveoli, so the oxygen from the alveoli is going to move into the pulmonary artery, which is low in the oxygen. All right, now I have to get my pointer off so you can see the animation of the oxygen moving from the alveoli into the pulmonary artery. Now let's take a look at and then what happens to the oxygen that's inside the pulmonary artery. So now we know hemoglobin is in there, right? The hemoglobin has a great affinity towards oxygen, so they are the ones that carry the oxygen to the rest of the body. So those hemoglobin actually grab those oxygen and they store in them so it can be transported to the rest of the body. All right, now let's look at the carbon dioxide now. So what happens in the carbon dioxide? It's the same concept. So now we have more carbon dioxide inside the pulmonary artery, and then we'll look at how the carbon dioxide got there in the following slides. And then the air in the alveoli, which is in the atmospheric air, the carbon dioxide is lower. So what happens is the carbon dioxide moves from the pulmonary artery back into the alveoli. So what happens in the alveoli? We breathe out the air. So we breathe out the carbon dioxide that we have so much inside the body back in the air. Okay. Now let's look at what is happening inside the cells. Remember, we had so much of carbon dioxide, and how did all this carbon dioxide come about? Now for that we need to take a good look at the one of the cell organelles, and the name is the mitochondria. Do you know what's the other name for the mitochondria? Which is the powerhouse of the cell, right? What happens in the mitochondria? Okay, mitochondria. So it's a very pretty picture with the pink and the blue. And let's see what happens inside this mitochondria. Okay, glucose enters into the mitochondria. So where does the glucose come from? It comes from the food that we eat, right? We eat food to produce more energy, and that's why we need food, so it can be converted into glucose, and then we breathe in oxygen. So remember the oxygen that we just discussed? So that oxygen comes into the mitochondria. And what happens when they come into the mitochondria? They produce energy through various chemical reactions. And when they produce energy, remember when we talked about eating food? So when we eat food, it goes into our GI system or stomach or small intestine, large intestine. It comes out as a waste product. Same thing happens in the mitochondria. So it takes in the glucose and the oxygen, and it produces ATP, which is the energy, but the byproduct, which is the waste product, is the carbon dioxide. So what happens when the carbon dioxide goes gets produced so much? Because the mitochondria produces energy based on the activity that we do. So if we are running, if you're swimming, if we are doing plowing the snow or any strenuous activities, the mitochondria produces a large amount of energy. So when it produces large amounts of energy, it also produces large amounts of carbon dioxide. So our body has a system to sense that, especially the brain. The brain is very irritant to the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. So what it does is it stimulates the respiratory center in the brain. So what's the name of the respiratory center? Medulla oblongata, right? So that's the respiratory center. So it directly stimulates the lungs to breathe faster, to get rid of the carbon dioxide and to take in more oxygen. So same thing happens when the oxygen level goes down. Again, that's the brain does not tolerate that, and it stimulates the respiratory center, which is the medulla, and then in turn it stimulates the lungs to breathe faster, so more oxygen can get into the body. All right, so this is how the mitochondria produces energy, and that's how the carbon dioxide gets produced as well. Finally, Bob reached home and he is relaxing very safely, and you should be also relaxing, but because now you reviewed the respiratory system, so you kind of know how the respiratory system works. Now you can comfortably conquer pathophysiology and pharmacology. Good luck with everything.